My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Gisela Kreglinger. It's April 16th, 2025, and Gisela is joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us today to speak about yourself and your wine story. Um, First question to get things started is why wine?
I grew up on a family-run winery in Franconia, Germany. And so that experience of growing up in a family winery that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and also growing up in the church, in the Lutheran church, really deeply, deeply shaped who I am. An agrarian setting, a tasting room. I mean, our tasting room was literally open nearly 7 days a week, except Sunday afternoons. And then just all the hustle and bustle of life on the winery, and also the community that vintners and wine people create. I mean, my family were very connected with other vintners that we would go on holidays with and have, visit on Sundays. And it was just a very unique world to grow up in. And when I left Germany, I studied abroad in a couple different places, maybe more than a couple. I realized what a unique gift that was, both in terms of the agrarian setting, but also the particular role that has in shaping your cultural setting, but also in my case, my faith tradition. I grew up in the Lutheran faith, and so the wine actually, sort of the whole wine world had a big impact on that. And I became a theologian, and I went abroad, and people didn't drink wine, and I was quite shocked by that because, first of all, wine is an incredibly beautiful gift. It profoundly shapes who we are as people and as communities. And then to talk about the faith tradition, that has always been a central part of the Judeo-Christian faith. So to come across Christians and theologians that didn't drink, well, they did drink, but no alcohol, was quite a strange experience for me, and made me really wonder about the unique story that North America has had in their relationship with alcohol, because that's where I landed. That's where I started teaching. So, yeah, this childhood experience on a winery and growing up in a church really has been with me and has shaped what I do as a professional now.
Tell me about your early impressions of wine growing up around it in that way. What interested you about it? What were your sort of impressions, especially as a child, of wine and of agrarian vineyard type life?
hmm Well, sort of some of the earlier memories that I have is my mom loved being out in the vineyard, and all of her friends from town were also working in the vineyard. So I spent quite a bit of time at the bottom of the vineyard in a playpen while my mom was in the vineyards. And she and my father too, but my mom even more so, had a deep, deep love for nature and for the vineyard and the work in the vineyard. She would tell me, Gisela, to be a vintner's family is one of the most beautiful things that you can do here on earth, because you get to plant a vine, you get to attend a vine, you get to harvest grapes, you get to craft wine. And then we have a tasting room, and you get to tell people about the wine and how it's made. And you know that it brings joy to them. And for my mom, even though running a family business, crafting wine is very, very hard, she still instilled that in me. That's a very, very beautiful thing. So I remember that. And then the other thing I remember is when, harvest time was always the most stressful time of the year. And I remember the grapes coming in, being crushed and then pressed. And sometimes they would let us hold a little glass, a tasting glass, under the grape um, under the press, excuse me, to catch some of that grape juice. And I remember drinking it, and I just was so amazed. It obviously it was sweet, but it was also just really, really beautiful. It was thick and nothing like we ever drank, buying from the supermarket. And I just remember wondering, it's like, this is pretty amazing, and just sort of feeling this sense of wonder for the world and the wonder for wine. And then I also remember very vividly when I got confirmed into the Lutheran faith at the age of 14. You have to have at that time 2 years of classes to help you prepare about understanding what happens when you get confirmed, and what happens in the Lord's Supper, which is a very important ritual in the Christian faith. And I remember, trying, you had to sort of really memorize that, because at that time you still at your confirmation were in front of the church, and the pastor would ask you questions and you had to respond to them, right? So you had to give the right answer. That's so German. Anyhow, I remember about, okay, this Eucharist is about, Christ died on the cross. The wine reminds us of the blood of Christ, and it's about my forgiveness of sins. And it sort of, I remember thinking this is about between me and God. And then I remember when when I got confirmed and for the first time partook of the Eucharist, and when the chalice came, and I sort of I love getting good gulps, and I'm sure I had a really good gulp of the wine. I remember smelling it, and it smelled like home. And I'm like, wow. And I just hadn't put together that my family makes the wine for the Eucharist. And so I smelled and tasted the life on the winery. I remembered the people that worked for us and some of their really hard stories, and our story of running a family business and how hard that was. And I remember thinking then, could it be that the Lord's Supper is about more than just me and God? Could it be that it's about God redeeming everything, including the really hard work on a winery? Our worries about frost coming in, having enough of a harvest, all the worries. And I thought, wow, maybe God is more involved in this world than I ever thought. And the way I thought about it wasn't the way I talk about it now, but it sort of started my sort of wondering and pondering about, have we narrowed, our vision of our relationship with God to this sort of Jesus forgives my sins, rather than this is an incredibly beautiful and complex world. And is God involved in this? And is part of his work to help heal our relationship with the natural world? So I remember that very vividly, and also just being startled that what we made on the winery suddenly was used in this very sacred ritual to communicate something very profound about our faith. I think those are some of the sort of memories that I still ponder about as an adult.
Pretty profound experience to have at that age. That's very interesting. Tell me about your path sort of into school. At what point did the theology path become something you were interested in, and where did it take you?
Yeah, actually, my undergraduate degree is in economics and bank administration, and my father was very excited about me having a career. I was enrolled in a master's degree, and he thought, "Oh, that's going to be a really good profession for my daughter." And then I decided to become a theologian, and he was very upset about that. He called it breadless art, and didn't know what to do with all of these questions that I had, and it was very hard for him. He was a very practical man, and a business person as well as a good vintner. And so that was really hard. But I had always questions, and I always asked questions. And so I think being able to study theology was just really something that I was deep within me. And I actually went to Vancouver in Canada to a graduate school there to study it because of the emphasis on Christian spirituality. And we had a philosopher professor who's actually from Oregon originally, Lauren Wilkinson, who had a huge emphasis on creation and our relationship with creation and redeeming our relationship with creation. And so for me as a vintner's daughter, I deeply resonated with this much more holistic approach to theology. So I think that really set the stage for me, I did 2 master's degrees there, and being able to study theology in a much more interdisciplinary way. And then when I did my PhD at the University of St. Andrews in historical theology, again, I wanted to do very interdisciplinary work, because I think we need to reconnect the dots. In general, that's what we need to do, but especially in theology and for people in the church, there's sometimes such a narrow emphasis. Now they call it the Anthropocene, too much emphasis on us and our relationship with God, rather than looking at the wider community of creation. and our relationship within it, and also healing our relationship with it. And I felt like growing up on a winery, my not only my father, but the whole community we're a part of, they always said, we must leave the place better than we found it. That was true for the vineyard. That was true for the soil. That was true when we went somewhere and visited. And I think all of those things just really inspired me as I was teaching theology in quite a conservative seminary. And it was a good experience, but also I was like, okay, you guys, you need to think a lot more organically. And so when it came to write my second book, in order to get tenure, you have to write books. I was talking to publishers and suggested various things. And then they said, well, do you have anything else you want to write about? And I said, well, I would quite like to write a book about the theology and spirituality of wine. And they perked up and they're like, here's my card. Once you have a proposal, get in touch. And I just was just so surprised. I thought about writing in that round because there isn't really any theologian. I mean, there are works that look about wine in the Bible a little bit. And there was a German PhD. But in general, especially in North America, there was a lot of literature about why wine in the Bible wasn't alcoholic and why we shouldn't drink, which, coming from Europe, I was like, wow, how how could people get to this place that they would so reject this long tradition? And then I realized, and I've written about that, in America, a lot of people still carry a lot of trauma with them about their very particular history with alcohol and especially hard liquor. And so I went to understand that. I talked to a lot of my students, colleagues, started reading about it and realized, well, they have a very different history with alcohol. So to help North America sort of heal in their relationship with alcohol and understand how wonderful and beautiful the gift of wine is will take quite a bit of effort. And so that's sort of been my work over the last 12 years. I've written now 3 books and created a video study with a study guide with a pastor, really to help the church in North America engage with that amazing reality. It's a huge theme in scripture. It's a huge theme in the history of the church. Obviously, it's a 8,000-year-old history. Wine has shaped so many of the great civilizations of the world. And I feel like North America needs to embrace this gift a lot more. And it's very exciting to me that nearly every state in the US now has a winery. And people are understanding it a little bit better now. And so I feel like it's been wonderful to be helping get that conversation started and encouraging both vintners, but also especially people in the church to take seriously wine as a gift from God and support and encourage vintners in their very hard work of crafting wines of place and of beauty that can help shape our country today.
Oh, fascinating. I'm curious, you mentioned sort of the attitudes you ran into to start with. Tell me about sort of the American relationship with wine, especially the religious American relationship with wine versus what you were used to.
Well, and I'm going to give a snippet. I write about that both in the spirituality of wine and then in cup overflowing in particular, because that's for the North American church. You have to realize when the pilgrims first came, they brought with them the European traditions and they loved wine and they wanted to plant vineyards on the East Coast, but they couldn't because of the climate. The vitis vinifera that they brought from Europe wouldn't take. And so that was a big hurdle. Beer, making beer was different. And so that really made wine not affordable for the everyday person. Of course, people of means were able to import wines from Europe, but the everyday person wasn't. And then what happened is, because there was also already a tradition of rum drinking, and then the tradition of making whiskey evolved. And I talk about George Washington in particular, who grew up in a very cultured setting, enjoyed wine, and distilled spirits in a very sort of responsible way. And when he retired from being the president, he withdrew to his estate, Mount Vernon, and he hired a Scottish estate manager who had fled Scotland because the Scottish government had put heavy taxes on making distilled spirits because people were abusing it. There was just too much of it. And so they increased the taxes, and that helps with reducing consumption. So he wanted to go to America where you had no limits whatsoever. And he talked George Washington into starting the largest distillery in America. And you can see from the historical records, he's starting that and making that into a lucrative business. The startup of new distilleries in Virginia just exploded, and then along the East Coast. And so distilled spirits became a primary drink for the American people. And you have to remember, this is the first time in human history with the Industrial Revolution that we were able to mass produce distilleries and distilled spirits and to have it readily available for the wider population. Now, then think about, the Civil War and in general, how hard life was for those pioneers, the isolation and the turbulences, or even think about the Great Depression later on. That those were really hard seasons, and people started to self-medicate. And there are these periods of, the severe binges that Americans had. And as I said, it's a very, very different story from places like Italy, Germany, France, Spain. I mean, the UK with the Industrial Revolution had a similar story. But I think that put Americans onto a path of drinking quite heavily distilled spirits to this day. Americans on average drink twice as much hard liquor than Europeans do. And I think that's very difficult. And the wine consumption is still very, very low. And I think wine does something very, very different. When Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador to France for the US, he was there at the beginning of the French Revolution. And he noticed that people didn't abuse wine. And he realized, wow, wine is something very different from hard liquor. And when he came back, he worked very hard to plant vineyards, wasn't able to do it, but emphasized we need to drink more wine and less distilled spirits. But anyhow, this particular history and the trauma that has come with people abusing hard liquor, and that really started the temperance movement. And then the temperance movement got picked up by the Great Awakenings, which were spiritual awakenings. And so some churches took on the concern of the temperance movement. And in the beginning, it was only against distilled spirits, and it was only later that they included wine. And I think this history is very important to understand in the trauma that has come with the abuse of distilled spirit and the havoc that it created in families, that to this day, there's still many, many people who have that kind of trauma somehow in their family context. And heavy drinking is still a big problem, especially in the South where I live. And so I think we need to become aware of that. We need to talk about it. And that's what I'm trying to do right now. I've been in Central Washington for 3 weeks to get Christians and wineries to talk about this history, to talk about the trauma, and then say, okay, we need to find a better way forward. And for me, that means that we have to have a public conversation about it, because the US has not been able to develop the cultural knowledge of wine and how to drink it responsibly and joyfully in the right places. Because there was such a cut with alcohol, that sort of cultural knowledge that evolves over many, 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 many generations and centuries is not here yet. And so I think the wine world tries really hard to sort of cultivate that, at least some parts of the wine world. But I feel like churches should take an active role in that, because there is so much talk about wine in the Bible. And churches, above all, should be the ones that learn how to drink responsibly, to find the places where it is good to drink wine. And then also, we have a lot of wisdom in the Bible about when to drink and when not to drink, and to drink in moderation. So that whole tradition needs to be unearthed. And that's what I've been trying to do, to say, listen to the Bible for those of you who want to take the Bible seriously, or listen to the history of the church. This is an important theme we've always wrestled with in the history of the church. Wine is a gift from God, has a powerful mission in our society, and we can learn how to enjoy it well in the right rituals and then set the right boundaries. And I think this conversation is slowly happening. And this is, like I said, in the last 3 weeks, I was just speaking in churches and encouraging pastors to talk about it, because a lot of pastors don't want to talk about it. It's a touchy subject matter, but I think it's time. It's time that the US had an open conversation about it, understood its history a little better, and then said, how can we move forward in developing a healthy and wholesome and joyful relationship with wine? And be easy on the hard liquor.
Tell me about, you mentioned the sort of the role wine plays in the Bible, and how it's sort of been downplayed in America. Tell me about, from your perspective, the role of wine in the Bible. What is its role, and what is sort of, why is it as prominent and prevalent as it is?
Yeah, yeah. There are nearly 1,000 references to wine and wine-related themes, agricultural themes, sacrifice themes in Scripture, and it's deeply woven in the story of God's creation, provision, and redemption. And fundamentally, wine is understood as a gift from God and a blessing. When the patriarchs, like Isaac, blesses his son Jacob, major figure in the Bible, he speaks this over his son: may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. And so from that time in Genesis, the theme of wine being a tangible blessing from God is carried throughout Scripture. And I think that elevated wine in a significant way. And wine is is one of the sacrificial offerings that the Jewish people were to bring to the temple. So again, it's elevated to this woo. This is a very special gift from God. And then the role that wine has, I think fundamentally it is that social glue and lubricant. But in Psalm 104, it says, God gave wine to make glad the hearts of humanity. Now that is profound. So in the biblical vision, wine is to bring us joy as communities. This is not addressed to me as an individual drinking at home. This is addressed to a people that live very hard agrarian lives. Most of the people, the way they earned their living was very strenuous. They didn't have a lot of distractions, and life was hard. So to gather together and to make a meal and to have wine that elevates a meal into this festive occasion was an important way that believers lived into their faith. And in the Bible, God commands his people to celebrate. People are to celebrate, and through these celebrations understand that God was their creator and redeemer. Think about the Passover meal, or think about the Lord's Supper. And wine was part of the storytelling of God's deliverance, God's provision, and then wine helped them to joyfully lean into that reality. And to be blessed by God was to be settled in a place where there was agricultural abundance, where everyone had their own little plot of land and their own little vineyard and fig tree orchard, and living in peace and safety. And that was the vision in the Bible of how God blessed them. But also when God's people weren't faithful to God, when they neglected to take care of the poor and the vulnerable and the orphans, and became greedy, amassing land and oppressing the poor, God also said, I'm going to withdraw all of those gifts from you, including wine, because you are not doing what I have asked you to do. You receive my blessing so you can be a blessing to others. So that's also part. And when you read about the latter prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, they talk both about the withdrawal of the agricultural abundance as part of God's punishment, but also when God redeems his people, there will be feasting and celebration and wine flowing in great abundance. The hills will be, flowing with wine down the mountains. And I think that's really important. This vision that God's redemption is envisioned as a feast. So in the New Testament, when Jesus performs his first miracle of transforming water into wine, he actually speaks to those promises of the prophets. And that's how they know that God's redemption is near. An abundance of wine to help them celebrate is a sign of God's redemption, both literally and then also metaphorically. And then, of course, when Jesus celebrates the Passover and turns it into the Lord's Supper and lifts wine to talk about his blood shed on the cross, wine is elevated to new heights. It is through um, the wine in the whole winemaking process that believers understand something about what God has done in Jesus Christ dying on the cross. So, I mean, this is just sort of a very brief snippet into a profound theme in Scripture: wine as a gift from God and as a blessing and as a sign of his redemption.
So you mentioned that you have traveled a lot, especially around America for this. Tell me about at what point Oregon became part of your journey, and at what point you sort of I know it became part of one of your books. So tell me about
Yeah,
how that came to be.
yeah. So I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, from my first teaching job at a very conservative seminary where you weren't allowed to drink any wine or alcohol, not just on campus, but at faculty retreats. And it was such a culture shock for me. I mean, thankfully, I found a chapter of the International Wine and Food Society in Birmingham, and that was a very sophisticated lot of wine drinkers who also enjoyed good food. And that was my salvation. That group was just so great. And they had wonderful wine cellars. And one of the wine regions that they really enjoyed was Oregon. And I got to sample beautiful, especially Pinot Noirs that I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And as I was getting ready to do some research for my, first big book called The Spirituality of Wine, I was talking to several of them, and we Oregon was obviously a place that I wanted to go because of the beautifully crafted wines. They weren't mass produced, they weren't loud, they had subtlety, they had finesse, they had the kind of beauty that I was accustomed to from Europe. And so, people from the Wine Society were the ones that really helped me set up interviews with Jason Lett, Russ Rainey, Steve Derner, um, people who really craft lovely, lovely Pinot Noirs. And I wanted to talk to them. And I wanted to hear, whether they had any spiritual inclination. If not, how they envisioned their work in the vineyard. And so as I was traveling over there, I happened to be there for the Pinot Noir Festival, which was amazing. I got to talk to them quite extensively, and especially with Russ Rainey, who was, one of the pioneers and helped start the Deep Roots Coalition. We just kept sort of on friendly terms and wrote back and forth. He loved going to Franconia, where I'm from. He knew that wine region really well. And that was another thing that I really loved about talking to those vintners, especially Russ Rainey and then also Jason Lett, is that David Lett had developed quite friendly relationships with German vintners. And so I also loved that sort of cross-pollination, how they had learned from various wine regions, not just German wine regions, but of course also from Burgundy, for example. And it was a deeply moving experience for me to be in Oregon and to hear these vintners reflect so thoughtfully about the work that they did, how devoted they were to the craftsmanship, but also the spiritual inclinations. I mean, Russ Rainey was an Episcopalian, so he had thought quite a lot about that. Steve Derner is Catholic and was playing the devil's advocate with me. And then I remember Jason said, "Well, I'm not spiritual, so I don't think you want to talk to me." And I said, "Well, by the very nature of how you craft wines, I think you'll have a lot to say about the subject matter." And I think I was with him for 2 hours and I had the most fascinating conversation with him that was so inspiring for me in the work that I do. And then in the end, he said, the traditional God talk that he hears in churches is by far too narrow to capture the miraculous and the realities and the spiritual realities that vintners find in the vineyard. So I think even though I was only there for maybe less than a week, that time profoundly impacted me because I thought, here's a wine region in the US that wants to craft wine in a way that is beautiful, sustainable, creating wines of expression and subtlety and nuance. And these wines will shape American culture because the wines themselves, not the wine talk, not the wine experts, it's beautifully crafted wines that are delicate, that have nuance, that have expression, that as people continue to drink those, they will impact those people, their conversations, their collaborations in ways that they can't even express. And that over the long term will bring a lot of benefit in terms of culture and I hope also spirituality.
So in your research for that book in Oregon and elsewhere, what did you find were sort of the key themes, I guess, the ties between vintners, spirituality, and were you surprised by what you found?
Um, Great question. I think obviously I sought out smaller producers that really wanted to allow the place to sing its song. So I was very careful about whom I sought out to talk to. So you will only get a very particular snippet of the wine world. But I wanted to really find people who were deeply involved in what they were doing. So not owners of a big winery, but actually owners of a winery or people who actually work in the vineyard and in the cellar. And I think what moved me so much is how they really wanted to understand a particular place and then plant something there that it was able, a great variety that was able to really capture the beauty and the particulars of that place and how they took seriously the created world, nature with its rhythms and intricacies. And they were willing and humble enough to sort of listen and to sort of submit themselves to that greater reality. And one of the things that I loved hearing is we don't make wine, we shepherd it along. We are midwives of a vintage. We're not making this great wine. We are only stewards of what's been given, and we are trying to protect it and safeguard the fermentation process, or listen to the soil, healing the soil, listen to the climate and all that is happening in that place, and then plant vines that can capture that beauty well and can thrive there and then let that happen naturally. And I was really surprised to find the Deep Roots Coalition in Oregon, a group of vintners that's really dedicated to try to farm as naturally as possible and do as little irrigation as possible. And how thoughtful they were and how dedicated they were to something that's very, very challenging. So rather than trying to make life easy for themselves, they were like artists devoted to their craft and wanting to go that extra mile, living through painful seasons of droughts and less rain because they wanted the vines to really struggle and develop deeper roots so that they could be perhaps a more complex expression in the wine. So I think that dedication to the place, to healing a place, to allowing the place to sing its song, and yeah, then also the community, like the Deep Roots Coalition, that sense of community and doing that together so that they can offer something not only to their state but really to the whole country, something that reflects place. You know, some people call it terroir. The Burgundians call it climat. And when I was then at the Pinot Noir Festival, and for the first time had this match of wild caught salmon grilled over charcoal in that Pinot Noir, and then they had these green beans with Oregon hazelnuts, and a wine and culinary culture emerged, and I encountered that I had not encountered before, and it was just so beautiful. And I thought, yeah, these vintners are going to shape this state in this country on the long run, not in the next year or two or decades, but 50 years, 100 years. And people will realize this is so beautiful when you are in a particular place and you blend what's grown naturally, like the hazelnuts. And now the truffles. I had some truffles, they were really gorgeous. And then these beautifully crafted Pinot Noirs, or obviously Chardonnays as well. And that was so encouraging to me when I have come a lot of wines that were just mass produced. They were loud, they had no nuance, that made a lot of people say, well, what's the big deal with wine? I don't get it. And I thought, if people go to Oregon and see that, they will get it, because there's a beauty, and the beauty in the wine and the food shapes the culture into a community. And that's what I saw, that the other very important part about that is that the community and the collegiality, not to see one another, first of all, as competitors in making a lot of money, but a community that offers something beautiful that can nourish, again, the community, and allow beautiful things to grow.
So tell me about the work you've done since. Obviously, you've created coursework around this. You have a new book out. Tell me about the sort of the continuation of this work
Yeah.
from the spirituality of wine forward.
Yeah. I mean, I realized, because no one had really written in a serious way about the biblical, theological, and spiritual dimension of wine, my first book was a very, very carefully researched work. And that has, maybe I packed too much into it. I wanted both theologians to take it seriously, and they have, but I also wanted the wine world to take it seriously. So that Carlo Petrini and Alice Waters endorsed it was really important to me, because I wanted to sort of reach into that world. But it also meant that for sort of the ordinary reader, it wasn't as accessible. I mean, I wrote it in an accessible way, but not everyone wants to have that level of writing. So I then wrote a more autobiographical book called The Soul of Wine, to help people understand what it means to grow up in an agricultural setting on a winery and on a farm. And then I developed some of those themes a little bit more in an organic way. And then the last book that I wrote, Cup Overflowing, I wrote for the North American church, because I wanted them, and it's also more accessible. That the idea behind this is, okay, we need a more accessible book to the spirituality of wine. But then, books are like children, they take on their own sort of character, and it became more contextualized into the North American story, and trying to help the North American church pick this up, understand their history with alcohol and the importance of healing, but then also the importance of moving forward. So I have an appendix that helps families, churches, and communities have an honest conversation about alcohol and wine. And then I have an appendix that's called Wine Tasting as a Spiritual Practice. And that's what I have been doing a lot in North America. I do events, they're usually evening events where we have a wine tasting. But the way I do it is with every wine, I offer a meditation to help people reimagine what Christian faith, Christian spirituality, and Christian disciplines or practices can be like, to rediscover your sense of taste and smell as a very, very important senses for our knowing and for our knowing the world and also for our knowing of God. And that's been very, very fun. I think a lot of Christians are ready to get out of the narrow confines of what they've been traveling in. They want something much more sensual and something much more connected. And so that's sort of what we have been doing. And then the publisher said, oh, we should do a video series. So we created this 6-part video series called Wine in the Word. And that's for a more conservative community, people Christians who might be more fearful of things, and to help them understand the theme of wine in scripture, unpack it a little bit, and then also help them reflect on their relationship with alcohol and wine, their community's relationship with wine and alcohol, how to heal and how to have those conversations. Really trying to liberate the church in North America to take this more seriously, to take the Bible more seriously in that regard, and realize that we all should be agents of healing, but then also we need to bring people back to the table, whether you're Christian or not. This country needs to reclaim the table. For the first time in human history, imagine that, Rich. For the first time in human history, families don't eat together anymore around the table. That is not acceptable. We need to bring people back to the table, back to having honest and also hard conversations. We need to be able to hash things out. And so gathering around the table with some good wine and some good food. I have I have seen this growing up. Germans can be quite confrontational. We love hashing things out. We love arguments. You're only a good friends when once you've had a good argument with someone, and that friendship can withstand the tension of it. And when you have your first glass of wine, you still think, "Oh my goodness, this person is just on a very different planet." After the second glass of wine, you're like, what were those differences again? And after the third glass of wine, you think that that person across the table is just the best person on the planet. And so I think wine has a way of breaking down those barriers and helping you let go a little bit and engage in thoughtful and hard conversations. So I think whether you are a believer or not, I think we all need to have an active role in reclaiming the dining table or whatever table you have as a primary furniture and technical device in the home. We need to shut down our computers. We need to shut down our phones. We need to get the kids back to the table, and our friends and those who we might not think they are friends. And we need to strengthen the social fabric again in a time when our social fabric is so brittle and thinned out that we are in a very scary time, and we need to rebuild. And each one of us needs to take responsibility and say, how can I do that? Well, get your table out. If you have a tablecloth, put that out. If not, don't worry about it. Maybe a little candle, and get a bottle of wine on the table and a loaf of bread and some butter, and rebuild out of the ruins.
So what comes next as you look ahead? What have you not done yet that you want to do, or what are the challenges you're taking on next?
I feel like I have one children's book that's been swirling around about this all that I'd like to sort of put on paper and get that birthed. But it's a creative process. For some reason, I haven't been able to do that yet. But I've just ordered a couple more children's books, older ones. I like older ones that include the vine and vineyards. They're not found in contemporary children's books, but they are in older ones. So that's a little project. But for the last 3 years, I've been teaching at a secular university, a class on the spirituality of food. And so the whole realm of food is also has been a very big concern of mine, and especially in North America, the food world is so broken, and people have a lot of people don't have access to good food. A lot of people don't know what it means to eat well, and we need to heal our relationship with food. So there's a lot written in various ways, but not as much from a theological perspective. And again, the Bible is full of talk about food. And so I'd like my next book to be about food and healing our relationship with food.
Tell me in this journey you've had, what are you proudest of so far? What is your greatest accomplishment or proudest achievement?
I think I'm very grateful that as a German, as an immigrant to my new home, I'm married here now. I'm going to become an American citizen. This is my country now, my people. I felt like I got to begin a conversation about the biblical, theological, and spiritual significance of wine and help mobilize the church to take it seriously. And I am very grateful for that. I feel like when I'm at the great threshold of stepping through death's door, I'm gonna look back and I'm gonna feel really grateful and giddy that I got to start that conversation or help start it.
Excellent. All the questions that I have for you today, anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to cover today?
Yes, I want to say to everyone who listens to this, um, that wine is God's way of kissing humanity.
Those are fantastic words to end this on. I love that. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today, to share your story and your perspectives on wine and on Oregon and on spirituality. We really appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you.